7 years ago, I was almost killed by a terrorist. He aimed his gun at my head, and he fired. And for a split second, I thought that this was the end. I'd been alive for 20 years. It had been a short life, but it had been a good one. The terrorist fired, and his bullet missed my head by centimeters. Earlier that day, he had driven into Oslo, the capital of Norway, and he parked his car filled with a bomb he had built himself in front of the government headquarters. The blast there killed 8 people, and the buildings are still not rebuilt. Then he drove out to Utøya, where I was at summer camp with the Labour Youth Party. There he went on to kill 69 of my friends, bringing the total death toll to 77. This led to a lot of chaos, as you can understand. It was the largest terrorist attack in Norwegian history. His acts would forever cement the date, the 22nd of July, 2011, in our history books. The terrorist was not very different from me. He was Norwegian. He was not very religious. He grew up in Oslo. And this filled me with curiosity. I wanted to learn what made him so different from me. A reaction perhaps quite different from a lot of other people's. And so I started researching in the immediate aftermath. I got a hold of the manifesto he had written, 1,500 pages about his ideology. I went to the court, I gave testimony, and I listened to all of the other testimonies from experts and from other survivors, trying to understand why this terrorist had done what he had done. I didn't get the answers I was looking for. And so I started my journey. I traveled around the world meeting with former violent extremists, people who had been deeply ingrained in some of the most violent movements in this world, neo-Nazi movements in the Mujahideens, in FARC, and in the IRA. And I learned one thing from all of these people who had been in violent extremist movements. First of all, it's possible to stop being a violent extremist. Secondly, violent extremism is all about the violent denial of diversity, of the denial of people's right to be different, people's right to have a different belief system, a different religion, a different understanding of a religion, a different sexual orientation, in general, a different way of life. Extremists want to kill people who are different from them. We live in a very complex world, and extremists can't really handle this. This was evident in 2015, 2016, here in France during the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan and numerous other places. 245 people lost their lives in those years here. And 245 people is far too many, but still, France is a country with 66 million people, meaning that 245 people, or the chances of someone dying in a terrorist attack during those years was at 0.0002%. We have a tendency to overemphasize the chances of us dying in terrorist attacks, and this plays a big role in how the media is shaped, how politics are shaped. We live in a fear-driven society to a large extent, and fear is what also drives violent extremism. But if you look at the realities of it, in reality, the chances of dying in a car crash is 27 times higher than that of dying in a terrorist attack. Yet, terrorist attacks forms or policies, we securitize, we have military in our streets, we legitimize government surveillance. We become afraid of each other. We stop trusting our neighbors. And for some, like Anders Behring Breivik, this fear leads to disaster. So we all need to take a break. And we need to recognize the fact that complex questions require complex solutions. They require knowledge. They require an understanding of how our societies work and the realities of the threats we are experiencing. We live in communities, all of us, and our communities are rapidly changing. They're going increasingly online. I am of the first generation of people who grew up with the internet, with a computer in my house. And that has massively shaped how the last couple of decades has looked for our societies. We live in a world now with a 24-hour news cycle. Actually, we live with multiple 24-hour news cycles. And we are constantly bombarded with information. This is being used by all of us to make our decisions about how we are seeing the world. And that, in turn, is informing how we are interacting with each other. But in this ocean of noise, it becomes incredibly difficult to separate fact from fiction. And in this ocean of noise, it also gets increasingly difficult to get heard. Now, one of the most important factors in de-radicalization, in moving back out of violent extremist movements, is for people to get heard. And we need to take a moment to sit down and realize what the worldview of someone we radically disagree with actually is. And so my team and I got together and we asked ourselves, how do we actually do this at scale? There's so many conversations going on in the world. How do we harness all of that data? How do we use that in order to make it easier for people to listen to each other? We went around and worked with communities all over the world, and we have been working in classrooms and community centers and all over the place, listening to people's stories, trying to understand what is really happening to our society at large, not only in our own country, but also in Morocco, like on this slide. And one of the things we came up with is the fact that we all have difficulties thinking critically about the information we are getting. As I mentioned, we're all constantly bombarded, but we don't know with what. And so we are developing this tool, a tool that can map out news in a new way and show the relationships between journalism and commentary, that can show the relationship between journalists and specific journals, but also what sources are what journalists using. It will map it out in a graphical way and make it accessible for people. We can also map this out as a timeline, as a story evolves from the first piece of commentary to the last, or from the first breaking story until the last piece of commentary, giving people an overview of the multitudes of ways of understanding our society. You see, media is more complex than what we think, and it shapes all of our lives, and it shapes our politics, as we've seen so much. And so we need to learn to think critically. But complexity can be daunting. Complexity is incredibly difficult to deal with. And so another tool we've come up with to make this easier for people is a plugin for your browser that shows up when you're going onto a news site. Say, for instance, you're going on to Breitbart to read the news. And this thing shows up and shows you that, you know, New York Times wrote about the same thing from a different angle. And by doing this, we try to break down barriers. We try to start conversations between people. We try to create a space where dialogue will actually happen, where we are rewarding better behavior, where we are making sure people have more conscious discussions about what's going on in the world, and where flame-throwing and trolling and fake news becomes a thing of the past, but where opinion and diversity of worldviews is celebrated, where we celebrate the fact that our worldviews will be constantly challenged. This data is also incredibly powerful in that we can use it to understand how the world is changing, and we can understand what impact we are having on discourse. And so, in many ways, what we are doing is working to scale the work I started back in 2011 when I almost got killed by a terrorist and wanted to understand what I could do to make sure as few people as possible would have to go through something like that ever again, so that we could learn from each other, so that we could see each other, so that we could see the strength in our diverse communities and grow as society. Thank you all very much.